Audiobook by Kailash Matai. Mobile number 98501965542. India. Email is mediawise02@gmail.com. Darpan News Channel, PVF Prince Vijay, PVF Films, Miss Sakshi Motwani. Hema Teacher, Satya Kukreja, and Team. Chapter 3 will be coming soon. For book buying only. What's up us? 98501965542.
Jhulelal, the first ray of faith. The dark era begins. Long ago, in the sacred and fertile land of Sindh, cradled by rivers and steeped in the spiritual traditions of ancient India, there began an era of great darkness and sorrow. This was a time when the gentle rhythms of daily life, once guided by centuries-old customs, rituals, and reverence for the divine, were shattered by the rise of a cruel and oppressive ruler. The man who brought this suffering upon the people was a tyrannical sultan named Miraksha. Miraksha was not merely a ruler, but a symbol of ruthless domination. His ascent to power marked the beginning of a calculated campaign to erase the religious and cultural identity of the native Hindu population. The Sultan, driven by a fanatic zeal, harbored deep contempt for the beliefs, practices, and sacred traditions that had flourished in Sindh for generations. Under his rule, peace was replaced by paranoia, and faith by fear. What made his rule particularly terrifying was his uncompromising mission to convert the Hindu populace by force. Temples, once vibrant with chants and the ringing of bells, were defiled and destroyed, their sacred idols shattered in acts of symbolic violence. Celebrations of holy festivals were banned, scriptures were confiscated, and learned priests were either silenced or executed. Any resistance, whether in word, deed, or silent devotion, was met with brutal punishment. The Sultan's soldiers patrolled towns and villages like specters, watching for any sign of defiance. Entire families were dragged away in the dead of night, never to return, their only crime being their steadfast faith. The people of Sindh, once proud and spiritually rich, now lived in constant dread. Mothers whispered ancient prayers to their children in secret, elders passed down sacred stories in hushed tones, and communities clung to one another in the shadows, finding strength in shared sorrow. Even nature seemed to reflect the grief of the people. Skies were clouded more often, and the once celebrated rivers now mirrored the darkness that loomed over the land, yet, in the hearts of the oppressed, a spark of resilience remained. Despite the immense suffering, there were those who refused to forget the teachings of their ancestors. They held fast to their dharma, to the stories of Rama, Krishna, and Shiva, and to the belief that light would one day return to their beloved Sindh. They believed that even in the bleakest times, truth and righteousness would ultimately prevail. This was the beginning of the Dark Era, an age of tyranny, resistance, and spiritual endurance. And though the sun seemed to have set on Sindh's sacred legacy, the seeds of rebellion and hope had already been sown. A flame in the shadows. Amid the sorrow and suffering of Sindh, there emerged a child destined to defy the darkness, a flame that refused to be extinguished. In a humble village nestled between scorched fields and the ruins of once thriving temples, a boy named Jhulelal was born under extraordinary circumstances. The night of his birth was unlike any other. The skies, long draped in stormy gloom, briefly cleared to reveal a radiant full moon. A cool breeze swept across the parched land, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, as if nature itself recognized the arrival of a soul meant to restore balance. Jhulelal was born into a devout Hindu family, descendants of sages and temple guardians, whose lineage had been all but erased under Sultan Miraksha's brutal rule. His parents, Darayo and Mata Devki, had long prayed for a savior, not just for themselves, but for all who still clung to their fading faith. Their prayers were answered not only with a child, but with a symbol of divine promise. From a young age, Jhulelal exhibited wisdom and composure far beyond his years. As other children played in secret, he would sit quietly by the banks of the sacred Indus River, listening to its gentle murmur as though it were whispering ancient truths only he could hear. As he grew, so did the signs of his divine calling. It was said that when he spoke, his voice carried a calm strength that stirred the hearts of the fearful. Birds gathered when he sang hymns to the river, and even the most withered trees near his home seemed to regain a hint of life. Elders in the village began to call him a gift of Varuna, the god of water, and rumors spread that the boy was not merely human, but a divine incarnation sent to free Sindh from the grip of tyranny. News of Jhulelal's growing influence soon reached the ears of Miraksha's spies. The Sultan, threatened by the idea of a spiritual leader rising among the Hindus, ordered his men to investigate. But each attempt to capture the boy failed, as if protected by an unseen force. To his followers, these events were proof of his divine purpose. To his enemies, he was a mystery they could neither understand nor defeat. In the heart of the oppressed, Jhulelal became more than a boy. He became hope itself, a symbol of faith that could not be crushed, a voice that whispered, "Hold on, for the light is coming." And though the storm of tyranny still raged, the people of Sindh began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the end of the dark era had already begun. Chapter 2. The Silent Voice of the Indus. The Whispering Earth. Long before the rise of kingdoms and empires, before the drawing of borders and the writing of histories, there was a time when the world was still young, not in years, but in awareness. The earth had not yet been tamed by stone and sword. Instead, it breathed quietly, in harmony with the winds that drifted across plains, in rhythm with the stars that watched from above, and in song with the rivers that wove their stories into the soil. In that sacred time, there was no need for written alphabets to record wisdom. The rivers carried it, the stones remembered it, and the stars repeated it. In the heart of this ancient and whispering earth, a river was born, a river so vast, so vital, that it did not merely cut through the land, but gave birth to it. This river was called Sindhu, a name carried on the lips of sages and herders, spoken with reverence in hushed tones, as though to name her was to invoke a divine presence. She was not merely a ribbon of water, she was the river. She had always been there, it seemed, long before the people who would one day settle beside her banks. Born from the snow-fed wombs of the mighty Himalayas, the Sindhu roared and wept, danced and whispered as she descended from the high mountains, winding her way southward like a silver serpent through valleys that would one day cradle cities. But in those early days, there were no cities. There were only scattered lives, small human clusters who looked upon the river not as something to conquer, but as something sacred. To them, the river was not a resource. It was life. It was goddess, mother, teacher, and healer. They learned when to plant by watching her rise and fall. They bathed in her waters before ceremonies and whispered their secrets to her currents. They gave thanks with song and gesture, casting offerings of grain, flowers, and folded hands into her flow. They built small huts of clay and straw beside her banks, trusting that she would never abandon them, for she had been their constant, silent, powerful, and eternal. The land she passed through, lush, loamy, breathing with green, came to be known as Sindhu Desh, the land of the river. There were no kings here, no dynasties, and no fortresses yet. Just people, brown-skinned, sun-kissed, calloused from work, and bright-eyed with the hope only nature's bounty could provide. They hunted and gathered, fished in the river's bends, and began to tame the wild, not through violence, but through reverence. As the climate slowly grew warmer and more predictable, the river's faithful inhabitants began to settle more permanently. They planted barley and wheat. They raised cattle, goats, and water buffalo. They discovered that when the earth was patient, it could give more than one harvest. And so, they stayed. They did not yet know that they were becoming something remarkable, something the world would later call a civilization. They knew only that the land was generous and the river constant. Over generations, their hands shaped the land just as the river had shaped them. What began as humble huts became more permanent dwellings. What started as camps became villages. And eventually, quietly, a new chapter of human history began to write itself not in ink, but in brick, stone, and river mud. In these early days, language may not have yet been codified, but expression was everywhere. Children learned from watching, not just their parents, but the birds, the rain, the dance of leaves in the wind. Stories were told around fires with gestures and rhythm, through songs that mimicked the river's song. Wisdom passed not through scrolls, but through the repetition of ritual, the etching of symbols into clay, the patterns of weaving and painting. Time moved slowly. There were no calendars, but the people knew time. They watched the stars and understood the seasons. They read the moon as one reads a sacred book. They noticed the length of shadows and the silence before monsoons. This world had no written history, yet it remembered everything. And always, the Sindhu flowed. Sometimes she raged, tearing at the edges of her own banks, reminding those who lived beside her of her immense power. Sometimes she trickled softly, like a lullaby whispered into the belly of the earth. But always she gave. She gave water. She gave life. She gave direction. Rivers, after all, are not just sources of water. They are spines, the backbones of civilizations, and the Sindhu was no different. As her banks widened and her gifts multiplied, more people came to her seekers of life, of shelter, of peace. And with them came ideas, tools, animals, and seeds from distant lands. The world was beginning to stir with connection. At some point, unnoticed at first, the settlements along her edge began to transform. What had once been villages grew into towns, and then into cities. But these were not the cities of conquest or kingship that would later define empires. Number. These were cities of balance, precision, and community. They were built not to display power but to reflect harmony. Mohenjo-daro rose like a quiet dream from the river's touch, a city of right angles, straight streets, and thoughtful design. Not far away, Harappa mirrored its brilliance. These cities were miracles of planning, every house aligned with others, every drainage system connected to the next, every brick standardized in size. These were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of order, of care. They were the physical expressions of a culture that valued clarity, cleanliness, and coexistence. And yet, despite their brilliance, these people did not carve grand statues of themselves. They left no towering temples or monuments boasting of rulers and warriors. Instead, they left seals, small, square artifacts no larger than a palm, carved with images of animals, gods, and mysterious symbols. They left pottery adorned with flowing patterns, symmetrical and meditative. They left beads, bones, tools, and homes, the quiet objects of everyday life. They left behind a life well lived and a mystery that would survive millennia. Who were they? What did they call themselves? What songs did they sing when the rains came? What lullabies did mothers hum to their children as they drifted to sleep beneath the rustling reeds of the Sindhu? What prayers did farmers whisper before planting seeds in the rich, dark soil? No one can say for certain. Their voices, like the river, flowed on, unrecorded in books, but embedded in the rhythm of the land. And so the river carried them, their hopes, their crafts, their quiet wisdom. Through the centuries, she asked for nothing in return, only that they listen, that they remember, that they walk gently upon the earth and take no more than what they need. This was the voice of the Sindhu, silent, yet ever speaking, quiet, yet ever commanding. Born of water and clay, the land that stretched along the Sindhu was not just fertile. It was sacred. It pulsed with the rhythm of the river's seasons, and it bore within it the promise of sustenance, shelter, and story. This was no ordinary land. It was loamy, rich, and eager to yield, dark with ancient silt deposited by the meandering river over countless years. The people who found themselves here did not know they were settling into one of the most fertile regions on Earth. They only knew that when they pressed seeds into the ground, food emerged, and where food grows, life gathers. The story of civilization often begins with a seed. Along the Sindhu, it began with many: barley, wheat, lentils, and the wild grains that clung to the riverbanks. These were the first gifts the earth gave in partnership with human hands. And so the bond between human and land deepened. No longer just gatherers and hunters, these early people became cultivators, sculptors of time and soil. The rhythm of life began to sync with the rhythm of planting and harvest. Yet this was not an age of exploitation. It was an age of balance. The people learned not to overuse the land, nor to build beyond what they could tend. They learned to store grain, to dig wells, to rotate crops with care. There was no greed in this system, only survival woven with reverence. With agriculture came stillness, and with stillness came culture. They began to build with what surrounded them, the very mud and clay deposited by the Sindhu. Clay was more than material, it was memory. Clay held shape. Clay remembered hands. It remembered the fingers that pressed it into walls, the thumbs that smoothed it into pots. It carried the fingerprints of generations. And so, from earth and water, the people built homes, simple at first, and then increasingly intricate. The mud walls were coated with lime plaster, the floors were swept smooth. In time, baked bricks emerged, uniform, precise, created in kilns, built from the same earth they shaped. Their homes had flat roofs where people slept under the stars during the hotter months. Courtyards were common, open spaces where women pounded grain and children played while birds sang in tamarind trees. The hearth was the heart of each home, and around it revolved life. Cooking, storytelling, mourning, celebration. In the hands of their potters, clay became canvas. Pottery was not just functional, it was spiritual. Patterns emerged, flowing lines, geometric symmetry, swirls and motifs that spoke to a deeper order. Some painted in black on red slip, others etched their design. Before firing, even without a written script, these people communicated through form. Through their pots, their urns, their figurines, they left messages for those who would come after. Among these artifacts are the small clay figurines of women with wide hips and lotus hands, often wearing elaborate headpieces. Many scholars believe these to be early representations of the Mother Goddess, a divine symbol of fertility, abundance, and life. Whether or not she had a name, she had a presence. She stood as testimony to a culture that did not worship destruction or domination, but life-giving force, the feminine divine, embedded in clay and song. The river, too, was divine, not an object of conquest, but of devotion. Just as the earth gave shape to home and food, the Sindhu gave motion and meaning. Every aspect of their lives, from planting to bathing to prayer, was tied to the river's flow. They learned its moods, when it flooded, when it receded, when it could be trusted, when it must be feared, and so they built accordingly, raised platforms, flood channels, reservoirs to manage the seasonal surges. This was not engineering by domination, but engineering by listening. They listened to the land and responded. They worked with nature, not against it. Their tools were modest, copper blades, stone axes, terracotta plowshares. Yet their minds were quietly brilliant. They knew how to harness the wind, how to build granaries that allowed airflow to keep grain dry. They may not have written scrolls or epic texts, but their everyday solutions were acts of quiet genius. Their animals, too, were partners. Cattle were not just food, they were strength. Oxen plowed the fields, buffalo pulled carts, goats and sheep grazed at the edge of fields, and dogs guarded homes. From the earliest days, animals were part of the social fabric, respected, named, integrated. Slowly, a network emerged, not just of homes and fields, but of communities. Villages were linked by trails worn into the earth by footsteps and hooves. Goods moved from one place to another not for profit, but for sharing. Pottery styles began to spread. Beads made in one village turned up in another. Clay seals appeared, tiny squares bearing symbols and animal figures, perhaps used to mark goods or trade. These were the seeds of economy and language, though no one could have known it then. What is striking, even now, is the lack of hierarchy. Unlike later civilizations, with their towering temples, palaces, and statues of kings, the Indus culture shows no evidence of strong rulers. There are no monuments to conquest, no thrones or crowns unearthed from the soil. The homes are remarkably uniform, some larger than others, yes, but nothing resembling royal grandeur. This was a society of shared order, not enforced power. What guided them? If not a king, then what force kept their cities aligned, their drains connected, their bricks standardized across hundreds of kilometers? The answer may lie in collective wisdom, a shared cosmology, an agreed-upon balance between need and humility. This ethos can be felt in every artifact, every street plan, and every well. Water was sacred, and so it was managed wisely. Wells, sometimes private, sometimes public, were dug deep, lined with brick, and often placed beside homes for ease. Some cities had over 700 wells, each a testament to the trust between humans and earth. And from these wells came the water that cooked the food, cleansed the body, and purified the spirit. One cannot speak of this time without honoring the sounds of the era, the wooden flutes, the clay rattles, the beating of drums. Music, like clay, like water, was a medium of memory. Children would have learned to dance beside the flames of evening fires. Women would have sung songs to lull babies to sleep. Men, returning from long walks to neighboring villages, may have carried news and melodies alike. This was a world alive with rhythm. Not chaotic, but deliberate. Every aspect of life moved like a verse in an unwritten poem. Religion, if it can even be called that, was not institutional. It was woven into life. Rituals were small, humble. Perhaps an offering of milk at dawn, a clay figurine placed on a family altar, a chant whispered before a journey. There were no priests with power, no temples towering over homes. The divine was not something separate. It was everywhere, in the flowing of the river, in the shape of a seed, in the steady gaze of a cow, in the crackle of firewood. And so, from water and clay, the Indus Valley civilization was born, not with a bang, but with a whisper, not with conquest, but with cooperation. These early Sindhis, though they did not know themselves by that name, were already carrying forward a worldview that saw harmony over hierarchy, nature over dominion, and spirit within the everyday. What they built was not just infrastructure, it was a way of being, and always the river flowed. Its water filled their pots, its silt fed their fields, its curves shaped their cities, and perhaps most importantly, it carried their spirit, a spirit born of water and clay, into the future. The cities that breathed. To modern eyes, a city often means chaos, honking horns, traffic jams, endless rows of concrete, and towers that claw at the sky. But thousands of years ago, when humanity was still learning to live together in large numbers, the people of the Indus Valley imagined something different. Their cities did not scream with ambition, they whispered with wisdom. They were not monuments to ego, but to equilibrium. Carefully designed, gracefully balanced, and deeply human. Among these cities, none is more legendary than Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, as it is known today. But this name, given by archaeologists many centuries later, does little justice to what this city once was. Mohenjo-Daro was not a graveyard. It was a living city, a place of movement, of conversation, of trade and thought. Its streets echoed with footsteps, not silence. Its courtyards echoed with laughter, not mourning. It was one of the most advanced urban centers of the ancient world, a jewel of architecture, innovation, and organization. Built around 2600 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro was home to tens of thousands of people. Yet despite its size, it never lost its sense of order. From a bird's-eye view, the city resembles a grid, streets that run straight, cross at right angles, and form a rational layout that even modern cities often lack. This was not accidental. It was planned, thoughtfully, deliberately, and with care. Each block of the city was composed of multiple brick houses, some large, some modest, but almost all equipped with features that suggest dignity and practicality. Many homes had private wells, bathrooms, and even rudimentary toilets connected to drainage systems. That's right. Over 4,000 years ago, the people of Mohenjo-Daro had engineered an underground sewage network. Covered drains ran alongside or beneath the streets, connecting homes and public buildings to a complex sanitation grid. In an era when much of the world was still throwing waste into open spaces, the people of the Indus had already understood something fundamental. Cleanliness was life. But the marvels did not end there. In the heart of the city stood a structure that has intrigued scholars for generations: the Great Bath. This enormous rectangular pool, built of baked bricks and coated with a waterproof sealant, was fed by a well and drained through a sophisticated system. It wasn't just a swimming pool, it was a ritual space, a place for purification, for community, perhaps even for spiritual rebirth. Around it stood small rooms that might have been changing areas or meditative retreats. The bath was not a symbol of power, but of collective renewal, a sacred space for all. Nearby were granaries, massive storage buildings designed to hold tons of grain, elevated on platforms to keep pests and moisture away. This reveals not just technological know-how, but a sense of economic planning. Grain was likely distributed or traded under communal management. The city fed itself not through hoarding, but through coordination. On the other side of the civilization stood Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro's twin and equal. Though slightly older, it shared much of the same planning: gridded streets, uniform bricks, civic amenities. The bricks themselves followed a 1:2:4 ratio, a standard that spread across hundreds of kilometers. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was evidence of cultural cohesion, perhaps even central governance, not by a king or emperor, but by shared principles. What's striking in both cities, and many others like Lothal, Dholavira, and Kalibangan, is not just the structure, but the ethos behind it. Cities were not built to glorify rulers. They were built to serve people. There are no statues of kings, no temples towering over slums, no palaces of gold surrounded by poverty. The scale of equality in the Indus Valley is unmatched in the ancient world. Homes of merchants and craftsmen were often built side by side. No quarter of the city was left to rot. Everyone, from potter to priest, from child to elder, shared in the city's rhythm. Markets flourished in open spaces and near intersections, evidence of long-distance trade. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, seashells from the Arabian Sea, carnelian beads, and copper tools suggests a bustling economy rooted in fairness and craft. Merchants likely used clay seals to mark their goods, beautifully carved tiles showing animals like bulls, elephants, unicorn-like creatures, and inscriptions in a script that, even today, remains undeciphered. These seals were more than just tags. They were symbols of identity, personal, cultural, and possibly spiritual. The mystery of the script is among the most tantalizing aspects of the Indus Valley. Despite over 4,000 discovered inscriptions, ranging from short tags to slightly longer sequences, no one has yet decoded their meaning. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, the Indus script does not appear to have evolved into a larger literary tradition. But it speaks nonetheless, not through translation, but through design. The script suggests not just communication, but aesthetic intention. Its symbols are balanced, consistent, and often accompanied by animal motifs, hinting at a system that valued symmetry, memory, and perhaps even the sacred. Then there were the artisans, potters, jewelers, metalworkers, bead makers. Their craftsmanship was astonishing. Tiny beads of carnelian, drilled with microscopic holes, bronze figurines like the famous dancing girl, a confident, bare-armed youth cast in motion, hips cocked, eyes forward. She is just 10 centimeters tall, but her spirit is monumental. She is proof that the people of the Indus did not just build cities, they built expression, grace, and character. Public life, too, had its rhythm. Festivals may have been celebrated in open courtyards. Children likely played games. Dice, marbles, toy carts have all been discovered. Community decisions were probably made not by decree, but through deliberation. If there were leaders, they led by example, not by sword. Even in death, the people of the Indus showed humility. Burial sites reveal a respect for the deceased, but not an obsession with wealth or afterlife. There are no pyramids, no extravagant tombs. Graves are modest, with a few pots, beads, or tools, perhaps tokens of a life well lived. This suggests a worldview where the afterlife was not feared or glorified, but accepted. Life was the sacred cycle: birth, death, rebirth in nature's endless turning. What held these cities together was not fear or force, but trust. Trust in each other, in the land, in the river, in the values of mutual respect and interdependence. There are no signs of military conquests, no fortresses bristling with weapons. Walls existed, yes, for protection from floods, not people. This was a culture of peace, at a scale that history rarely repeats. Today, when we look at Mohenjo-Daro's ruins, its crumbling bricks under the blazing sun, we must not see decay, we must see continuity. For within those bricks lies an ancient intelligence, one that understood the geometry of compassion, the physics of coexistence, and the architecture of balance. These were not just cities, they were living beings, with hearts that pulsed through their wells, lungs that breathed through their drainage, skin that formed their bricks, and voices that echoed through their seals and songs. These were the cities that breathed, and the breath that filled them was the breath of the Sindhu. Epic poems, no royal proclamations carved in monuments, no dramatic murals of battles or gods. Instead, it left us something far more profound: silence. But it is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of intention, of a people who communicated not with volume, but with subtlety. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Indus script and the enigmatic seals they left behind. Discovered in abundance across Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and other Indus Valley sites, these seals are small, square tiles, usually made of steatite, a soft stone, engraved with short inscriptions and often accompanied by images of animals or sacred symbols. There are thousands of them, but none longer than 26 characters. The inscriptions have been found on amulets, storage jars, tablets, and stamp seals, which were likely pressed into clay to mark ownership, identity, or ritual use. The most famous among them is the so-called unicorn seal, a creature not found in nature, with a curved horn, facing a ceremonial object that resembles an incense burner or a sacred stand. Below the animal are symbols of the Indus script, fluid, linear, abstract. This image has become a symbol of the civilization itself, mysterious, elegant, reserved. But here lies the puzzle: we cannot read it. Despite over a century of research, the Indus script remains undeciphered. It does not resemble any other ancient writing system clearly. It isn't an alphabet like Greek. It isn't a syllabary like Japanese kana. It might be logographic, like Chinese, where each symbol represents a word or idea, or it might be a proto-script, a system that encodes concepts, but not grammar. Some scholars argue that it isn't a language at all, but a series of sacred symbols, more like a spiritual code than a sentence. Part of the difficulty comes from the brevity of the inscriptions. Most seals contain only 4 to 5 characters, too short to provide context for comparison. Without a Rosetta Stone, a bilingual inscription with known translations, there is little for linguists to build on. The language of the Indus Valley is unknown. We don't know what they called themselves, what tongue they spoke, or how their speech sounded. Some scholars propose early Dravidian languages, linking them to Tamil and other South Indian tongues. Others suggest links to lost Indo-Aryan roots, while some believe the language family has disappeared altogether. Yet, for all this mystery, the power of the symbols is undeniable. They are meticulously carved, some even etched on materials as tiny and hard as carnelian beads. The precision suggests the work of trained artisans, and the consistency across distant cities points to a standardized symbolic system. This wasn't random. It was deeply cultural. More importantly, these seals were not passive objects. They were active, stamped into soft clay to seal goods, perhaps worn as amulets, carried across trade routes as signatures of identity. Each seal may have represented a person, a family, a guild, or a community. Imagine a merchant journeying from Harappa to Lothal with a pouch of spices. He seals the bundle with his engraved tile, his mark of trust, a message of quality and lineage. That tiny object spoke for him. It whispered who he was, what he believed in, and where he came from. And what about the animals? The seals depict a rich, symbolic menagerie: bulls, elephants, tigers, ibex, fish, and composite creatures. These were not decorative. They meant something. The unicorn may have been a symbol of purity or divine presence. The humped bull, powerful and ever watchful, may have represented strength or fertility. The elephant, with its massive memory and grounded nature, might have stood for wisdom. Some seals even show scenes, a person sitting in a yogic posture surrounded by animals, known as the Pashupati seal. To some, this is an early image of Shiva, the lord of beasts. To others, it's a shaman or priest king communing with nature. Whatever the interpretation, the message is clear. These images were sacred. This blending of script and symbolism suggests a worldview in which language, art, and spirit were one. The seal was not just a tool, it was a prayer, a poem, a compact between person and cosmos. Even the way the script flows, often right to left but occasionally reversing, suggests a fluid understanding of form and meaning. Like the river itself, their communication meandered through known and unknown, through clarity and mystery. One might ask, why did they not write books? Why did they not carve stories into stone? The answer may lie in their values. The Indus people seem to have placed more importance on impermanence and balance than on conquest or self-glorification. Their script may have been used for trade, ceremony, or private record, not for propaganda. They didn't build ziggurats to touch the sky. They built baths to touch the soul. Or perhaps they did write books, on palm leaves, bark, and cloth, materials that time and moisture have since erased. The fertile floodplains of the Indus are excellent for agriculture but terrible for preservation. Unlike the dry sands of Egypt or the stone tablets of Mesopotamia, the Indus Basin swallows what is not baked, burned, or sealed. What we have left are only fragments of whispers, the remains of what was once a full conversation. But silence is not nothing. Silence, when intentional, becomes a form of presence. The silence of the Indus script invites us not just to decipher, but to reflect. Why must every civilization speak in the same ways, with kings and battles, with inscriptions of dominance? Perhaps the people of the Indus understood something we are only beginning to learn again, that harmony leaves fewer scars than war, that the deepest wisdom may not be shouted, but carried gently, like a seal pressed into clay. The very absence of ego in their records is its own kind of message. No glorified rulers, no boastful inscriptions, no statues of victory. Their monuments are drainage systems and beadwork, symmetry and sanitation, ritual baths and trade routes. Their greatness was not in how loudly they spoke, but in how deeply they listened, to each other, to the land, to the flow of time. And so the seals remain, small, silent, eternal. They do not beg to be understood. They merely offer themselves, again and again, to every generation that finds them. And in doing so, they honor a deeper kind of communication, the kind that outlives language, the kind that dwells in symbols, and the kind that echoes in the soul more than the mind. They are the eternal seals, pressed by hands long gone, yet still holding meaning. The tongue may be lost, but the voice, the silent voice, still speaks, and it is the voice of the Indus. He echoes of Sindhu Desh. A river is more than a body of water. It is a memory, a presence, a path not only through geography, but through language, identity, and time. And of all the rivers that have ever carved their way through the heart of civilization, few have been as influential, as eternal, as the Sindhu, the river we now call the Indus. To the people of the Indus Valley civilization, the river was more than nourishment. It was their soul. Their entire way of life was synchronized with its rhythms. It dictated the planting of crops, the timing of festivals, the architecture of homes, and the migration of trade. It was a river that gave rise to cities, to communities, to civilizations, and eventually to names that would define continents, cultures, and religions. The word Sindhu is ancient. Its earliest mentions appear in the Vedic texts, where it means river, or more precisely, a great flowing body of water. In the Rig Veda, one of the oldest known spiritual texts of the Indian subcontinent, the Sindhu is revered, praised for its power, its beauty, and its ability to give life. The Vedic seers did not just see it as a waterway, they saw it as a divine mother, an entity to be honored, worshipped, and remembered. But as powerful as rivers are, they do not remain untouched. They flow through valleys and cultures, through borders and generations. And so too did the name of the Sindhu, carried by the wind and altered by the tongues of travelers. The earliest foreign encounters with Sindhu Desh came from the West, from the ancient Iranians and later the Persians. Their languages lacked the S sound, so Sindhu became Hindu. It wasn't just a mispronunciation, it was a linguistic transformation, one of many that would ripple through history. To these outsiders, the land beyond the mighty river was the land of the Hindus, not in a religious sense, but as a way to identify the people who lived beyond the Sindhu. Thus, Hapta Hindu appeared in the Avesta, the Zoroastrian holy book, describing the land of 7 rivers, the Punjab Sindh region, which they saw as sacred and fertile. The name Hindu gradually began to signify the people of the Indus Basin, not their faith, not their ethnicity, but their geographic identity, rooted in the river. As centuries flowed on, language continued to reshape identity. When the Greeks under Alexander the Great arrived in the 4th century BCE, they encountered the same river, and through Persian influence, they referred to it and the people as Indos. From this came the Latin India, a term that would come to define not just a region, but eventually an entire nation. Later, the Arabic and Islamic empires brought the word Hind into common use. Al-Hind was how the Arab geographers described the Indian subcontinent. Hindustan, literally land of the Hind, began to appear as a political and cultural term during the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal period. Over time, it became synonymous with the broader northern regions of India. But in all these transformations, from Sindhu to Hindu, from Hindu to Hind, from Hind to India, the river remained the silent origin of it all. What is extraordinary is that an entire continent's identity would be rooted in a river and its ancient name, a river that birthed a civilization and then, slowly, quietly, birthed a language, a religion, a nation, and an enduring spiritual memory. Let us pause here and reflect on how profoundly language transforms culture, and how those changes, while seemingly superficial, carry deep consequences. The term Hindu, in its earliest usage, did not refer to a religion. It was a term of geographic distinction. It simply meant those who live beyond the Sindhu River. Over time, as the Vedic traditions evolved and interacted with regional cultures, the philosophical systems of dharma, karma, moksha, and the vast pantheon of deities crystallized into what the world now recognizes as Hinduism. Thus, the religion took its name not from a prophet, a sacred book, or a single divine revelation, but from a river whose flow was so deeply embedded in the psyche of the people that it gave rise to not only spiritual practice, but also to linguistic, ethnic, and national identities. This evolution wasn't linear, nor was it orchestrated. It was organic, a cultural current, meandering like the river itself. As waves of migrations, invasions, and exchanges swept across the subcontinent, from Indo-Aryans to Persians, from Greeks to Kushans, from Arabs to Turks to Mughals, the identity rooted in the Sindhu continued to evolve, adapt, and expand, but never vanish. Meanwhile, for those who lived closer to the original cradle of the Indus civilization, in what is now Sindh, a province in Pakistan, the word Sindhi remained a living cultural label. Sindhis became a distinct ethno-linguistic group known for their resilience, entrepreneurial spirit, hospitality, and deep spiritual traditions. Their songs still invoke the name of the river, And their festivals, like Cheti Chand, celebrating the birth of Jhulelal, the river god, continue to honor the Sindhu's sacred flow. Even after the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, a traumatic event that divided families and forced millions of Sindhis to migrate across borders, the memory of Sindhu Desh remained intact in stories, songs, prayers, and food. Sindhis in India, in Pakistan, and across the world still refer to their ancestral homeland as Sindhu Desh, the land of the Sindhu. The legacy of the river Sindhu goes even further. Its name is embedded in global consciousness. India, the country, the culture, the idea, is built upon the identity that originated from this river. Without the Sindhu, there would be no Indian subcontinent, no Indian Ocean, no incredible India. What is remarkable is that this enormous cultural edifice stands upon a linguistic slip, a phonetic shift. Sindhu to Hindu to Hind to India. It is as if the river had whispered its name to the world, and the world in its many accents continued to echo it. But this transformation wasn't merely historical or etymological, it was spiritual. The river taught generations that identity flows, that what you are called depends on who is listening, and that the core essence, the flowing, life-giving energy, remains unchanged even when the words do. This lesson is reflected in ancient Sindhi poetry. Take, for instance, the verses of Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai, a revered 18th-century Sufi poet of Sindh. He wrote in Sindhi, a language descended from the Prakrits of old, interwoven with Persian and Arabic. His poetry speaks of love, longing, nature, and the divine, all through the imagery of rivers, boats, and the voyage of the soul. For him, the river was both real and metaphorical, a path toward union with the divine. Sindhu Jo Sawan, Mohinjo Man. The voice of the Sindhu is my mother's song. In this simple line, a whole universe unfolds. The idea that our origins are not just genetic or geographic, but linguistic and emotional, shaped by what we hear, what we sing, and how we name the world around us. Even today, in a world driven by artificial borders and competing nationalisms, the river reminds us of unity. The Sindhu doesn't care about man-made divisions. It still flows, from Tibet to Ladakh, through the gorges of Gilgit, across the plains of Punjab, and finally into the Arabian Sea. It crosses religions, languages, and countries, carrying with it the memories of a civilization that once spoke without conquest, without kings, without ego. The story of Sindhu becoming Hindu and Hindustan is not just a linguistic fact. It is a reminder that our deepest roots are often silent, that we carry within us the echoes of rivers long forgotten, and that our names are more than labels, they are histories in disguise. And so the journey of a name becomes the journey of a people. From the ancient seals of Mohenjo-daro to the modern streets of Mumbai, from the sacred chants of Rigveda to the bustling bazaars of Karachi, the name Sindhu ripples beneath the surface of everything we are, and it whispers still, not just in the flow of the river, but in every word we use to define ourselves. The Sindhi spirit, songs of continuity and courage. When rivers part and borders rise, when languages shift and maps are redrawn, there is one thing that endures: the spirit of a people. After the mighty civilization of the Indus faded into mystery, and long after the linguistic drift turned Sindhu into Hindu and India, there remained a people who carried with them not just the name of the river, but its wisdom, its rhythm, its soul. They were and are the Sindhis. To understand the Sindhi spirit is to understand what it means to belong and to continue, even after being displaced. In 1947, as British India was divided into the nations of India and Pakistan, Sindh, the historical land of the Sindhu River, became part of Pakistan. For centuries, Sindh had been a place of plurality, home to Sufi saints, Hindu temples, Islamic dargahs, Jain shrines, Buddhist
ruins, and ancient Indus sites. People of many beliefs lived side by side, sharing water, food, language, and space. But Partition shattered this harmony. Overnight, entire communities were uprooted. Nearly 1 million Sindhi Hindus, a minority in Sindh, were forced to flee their ancestral homes due to rising violence, fear, and uncertainty. They left behind their fields, temples, homes, and graves of ancestors, often with just a cloth bag, a few rupees, and the memory of a land they loved. But what they carried with them was something even more powerful than property: their identity, their language, and their stories. Language as homeland. For people who had lost their physical home, language became their homeland. The Sindhi language, melodic and ancient, descended from the Sanskritic Prakrits and shaped by centuries of cultural fusion with Persian, Arabic, and indigenous tongues, became a living link to Sindhu Desh. It carried within it the flavors of ancient Mohenjo-Daro, the songs of Shah Abdul Latif, and the chants sung to Julalal on riverbanks. In exile, Sindhi was not just a means of communication, it became a vessel of memory. Families who had never lived in India before now found themselves scattered across Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and beyond. With no state of their own, Sindhis had to adapt quickly. And yet, in refugee camps and resettled colonies, children were taught to greet elders with Sain Sada Suki Raho, a Sindhi blessing. Mothers cooked Sai Bhaji, a traditional spinach lentil dish that tasted like home. Grandparents sang Lal Lal, Lal Julalal, the song of the river god who promised to protect the Sindhi people. Thus, even in alien lands, Sindh continued to live, not on maps, but in hearts and voices. The songs of survival. Partition brought trauma, but also transformation. Displaced but undeterred, Sindhis began to rebuild their lives with resilience. With few resources and little political backing, they turned to what they had always known best: enterprise, education, and spirituality. Sindhis are known across India and the world as successful entrepreneurs. From Ulhasnagar to Hong Kong, from Jakarta to Dubai, from Mumbai's business hubs to Los Angeles tech startups, Sindhis have created thriving communities. This was not merely economic activity. It was an act of cultural survival. Every Sindhi AFP shop, factory, or school became a place where the language was spoken, traditions remembered, and stories shared. Music and poetry played a central role in this preservation. Artists like Bhagat Kanwar Ram, Sundri Uttam Chandani, and Dayaram Gitamal became icons of cultural resistance and pride. Their songs were more than entertainment. They were oral archives, encoding history, faith, and moral wisdom in rhyme and rhythm. Folktales about Saswi Punhan, Umar Marvi, and Momo Rano, age-old romantic legends from Sindhi lore, were retold in diasporic classrooms, often paired with teachings from Guru Nanak, Kabir, and Julal, symbolizing the deep syncretic tradition of Sindhi spirituality. These stories taught the next generation that love, sacrifice, and truth transcend borders. In spiritual practice, too, Sindhis adapted with ingenuity. Lacking temples, they turned homes into shrines. In cities like Pune, Adipur, Ulhasnagar, and Ajmer, they built Julal temples, Sufi dargahs, and community halls known as panchayats, not only as places of worship, but as centers of learning and cultural revival. Every Cheti Chand, the Sindhi New Year, they celebrated not just their deity, but their ability to survive. Women, keepers of continuity. If rivers are the soul of a civilization, then women are its banks, silently shaping and holding the flow. Sindhi women played an invisible but monumental role in preserving culture. In the face of migration, loss, and poverty, they kept languages alive by singing lullabies, cooking ancestral recipes, telling bedtime stories, and ensuring that rituals, from Diwali to Navratri, to local Sindhi traditions, were observed. It was through Their voices that Sindhu flowed into the future. In oral histories collected from partition survivors, many women recall how they carried Sindhi books, images of Julal, or bundles of sacred grains across the border, not out of superstition, but to preserve a sacred continuity. These women were not just survivors. They were storytellers, educators, and the first librarians of Sindhi exile. The global Sindhi. As time passed and generations grew, the Sindhi identity evolved into a global phenomenon. Today, there are millions of Sindhis worldwide, spread across more than 100 countries. They are tech innovators in Silicon Valley, diamond traders in Antwerp, educators in Singapore, and spiritual leaders in Johannesburg. Wherever they go, they bring with them a piece of the Indus, often symbolized in the name Sindhi itself, which they wear with pride. But this global spread also brings challenges. Language is at risk. Many young Sindhis do not speak the language fluently. Cultural rituals are often adapted or forgotten. The river, for many, feels like a metaphor rather than a memory. And yet, something endures. In every diaspora Sindhi who asks their grandmother about Mohenjo-daro, in every digital archive of Shah Latif's poetry, in every Julelal sticker pasted on a laptop or water bottle, there is a whisper of the river, a memory of Sindhu Desh, and a deep, silent voice that refuses to be erased. The spirit of syncretism. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Sindhi spirit is its inclusive, bridge-building nature. Rooted in the pluralism of the Indus Valley, influenced by Vedic, Buddhist, Jain, Islamic, and Sufi traditions, the Sindhi worldview is deeply syncretic. Sindhis are among the few communities where Guru Nanak's teachings blend seamlessly with Bhagat poetry, where Hindu and Sufi traditions coexist in everyday prayer, and where festivals are shared, not segregated. This is no accident. It is the inheritance of a civilization that once thrived without weapons, wars, or walls. This makes Sindhi culture uniquely relevant today. In a world fractured by religious divisions and identity politics, the Sindhi model offers a blueprint for coexistence, one that says, you can be many things at once. You can be Indian and Sindhi, spiritual and secular, ancient and modern, rooted and global. Toward the future, as the Sindhi community moves forward into the 21st century, new efforts are being made to preserve and promote its heritage. Digital archives, language apps, cultural festivals, and youth conferences are emerging across the globe. Scholars are re-examining the ancient links between Mohenjo-daro's symbols and modern Sindhi motifs. Artists are blending traditional Sindhi embroidery with contemporary fashion. Musicians are reimagining Shah Latif's verses in modern genres. What all these efforts show is this: the voice of the Indus is not silent. It is singing in new tongues, new lands, and new generations. And in this song, the Sindhi spirit continues to live, as fluid as the river, as enduring as stone, and as sacred as the name Sindhu itself. The river lives on. Memory, myth, and the meaning of Sindhu. There are rivers that flow with water, and then there are rivers that flow with memory. The Sindhu is both. It begins as a physical current, carving valleys and nourishing plains, but becomes something more, a timeless presence, a voice without a mouth, a song without a score. Long after its civilizations have crumbled and its maps have changed, the Sindhu flows still in myths, dreams, names, and stories. In the heart of every Sindhi who has never seen the river, it still flows. In every child who utters the word Julelal without fully knowing why, in every prayer that begins with O Lal, Meri pat rakhiyo bala julelal. The river speaks. The river lives on. It lives in the bricks of Mohenjo-daro, sun-baked and mysterious, arranged with a geometry that whispers of lost intellect. Archaeologists decode drainage systems and citadels, but what the river knows is older than science. It knows how a mother once sang to her child as she ground grain into flour, how a potter once shaped clay while listening to the breeze over the water. That intimacy, the smallness, the slowness, is what endures. It lives in the seals and symbols, undeciphered but not silent, the fish, the horned deity, the dancing girl. These are not just artifacts. They are echoes. The Sindhu speaks in symbols, not because it cannot speak, but because it speaks to those who can listen beyond words. These images are mantras in stone, prayers in pictograph, waiting to be re-understood. It lives in the poetry of Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai, who sang in the Sindhi tongue but wove metaphysics, longing, and love into verses that resonated across faiths. In his stories of Sasui and Marvi, two women whose loyalty and love were stronger than kingdoms, the river becomes a metaphor for truth and transformation. Shah's Sindhu is not just a place, it is a state of being. It lives in the myths of Julalal, the child born from water to save a friend people, riding a fish, holding fire in one hand and compassion in the other. For some, Julalal is Varuna. For others, he is Khwaja, Khizr. For yet others, he is an idea, the embodiment of hope, that car floats, even in flood. He does not belong to one religion or region. Like the river, he is fluid, formless, and free. It lives in the women who passed on lullabies, in kitchens that recreated Sind in exile, in embroidery patterns that mirrored ancient pottery, and in the careful folding of saris that smelled like old land. These quiet rituals became acts of defiance and remembrance, small yet sacred. It lives in every generation born after partition who struggle with not having a land to return to, but still speak of back home, as call if the river is coded in their DNA. For them, Sindhu is a place never seen, but always known, like a myth carried in blood. It lives in the silence of forgotten scripts, the Indus Valley script that remains unread, and the Sindhi language itself, now often unspoken. But silence does not mean absence, it means waiting. The river waits for someone to read its song again, to understand that identity is not only in history books, but in the act of remembering. It lives in new forms, on Instagram posts of Sindhi embroidery, in YouTube songs that remix ancient bhajans, in TED Talks by Sindhi changemakers. In digital museums and diaspora journals, the Sindhu, once a physical frontier, is now a cultural constellation. Its banks have moved, but its waters still rise within. And what is the meaning of Sindhu? It is not a word. It is a world. Sindhu meant river, and then came to mean civilization. It meant identity, then Hindu, then India. It shaped the names of a subcontinent, a religion, and millions of lives. But beneath all these meanings is a simple truth. Sindhu means flow. To be Sindhi, then, is not just to belong to a place, it is to belong to a continuum. to belong to something ancient, adaptable, and always becoming, like water. Listening to the river. One day, a child asked her grandfather, "Where is our homeland?" The old man did not point to a map. He closed his eyes and began to hum an old song, a song his mother had sung to him during the crossing, a song about a river that never forgets. And that, perhaps, is the answer. The river flows, not just through land, but through language, whispered hand to hand, through memory etched in silent stone, through sacrifice born and never known, through spirit carried across the years in lullabies, in unshed tears. It is the silent voice of Sindhu's grace, a timeless song that leaves no trace, yet lingers still in breath and bone, in every exile far from home. It speaks not loud, but deep and low, like twilight winds that softly blow, or like a chant the soul recalls when night is deep and silence falls. The Indus speaks, though time has flown. In every heart it calls its own. We need not shout, we need not seek, we need only pause and let it speak. This is Chapter 2, End Audiobook. Audiobook by Kailash Matai. Mobile number 98501-96542. India. Email is mediawise02@gmail.com. Darpan News Channel, PVF Prince Vijay. PVF Films, Miss Sakshi Motwani. Hema Teacher, Satya Kukreja. And Team. Chapter 3 will be coming soon. For book buying only. What's up us? 98501-96542.